Well, good evening, folks. This is Congressman Rob Wittman. I am honored to be joined this evening by Senator Danny Diggs, former sheriff of York County and Poquoson. We appreciate having Sheriff Diggs, now Senator Diggs, on board with us. This evening's virtual town hall is involving public safety, specifically things related to public safety in our community. So we appreciate that. We want to hear your thoughts and questions, so please take the opportunity to put your question up in the prompt there that's on your screen. I'm going to update you on things that are going on in Washington. I want to make sure, too, that we understand the things that we can do to make Washington work in ways that are complementary to local governments, complementary to what's happening in the Commonwealth, and also complementary to the great job that Senator Diggs is doing there in Richmond. You know, our efforts here are really about supporting law enforcement and supporting communities too, making sure the things that are happening in communities are directed towards making things safer, holding criminals accountable. We see today, unfortunately, things many times moving in the opposite direction. There are a number of things that we've done here in Washington, things like the National Law Enforcement Officers Remembrance, Support, and Community Outreach Act. It's really about supporting our law enforcement officers. I'm a co-sponsor of that bill. That really commemorates the efforts and the sacrifices by our law enforcement officers, supports them and the great work that they do. I've also co-sponsored the Back to Blue Act, which creates new criminal offenses for killing or assaulting a federal judge, federal law enforcement officer, local law enforcement, or firefighter. We know many times that they are under duress, many times while they're doing their job. We see today the number of attacks and injuries and fatalities with law enforcement and firefighters, and for that matter, people in the judiciary, all unacceptable. Another bill, too, is Sammy's Law, which creates a parental right to know about dangerous or concerning online activities. We see more and more of that today. Online activities, whether it's things that are happening with bullying online or the newest of the conduits out there that unfortunately get provocative or I think counterproductive information to our young folks, platforms like TikTok. So we want to make sure that we require social media companies provide parental access to children's data through registered safe third-party apps. And then also the Debbie Smith Act provides grant funding to state and local governments to improve DNA collection process for local law enforcement to help get justice for victims of sexual assault. That's critical. That genetic information, that DNA fingerprinting information is critical to make sure that we're able to prosecute and convict sexual predators. Those things are key. We see what's happening at the border. I don't have to go into depth on that. We see the record number of people coming across the border, the illegal crossings there. We see what's happening in our communities. We also see the impact of the opioid crisis. We see fentanyl deaths at an all-time high. The last 12 months, well over 100,000 deaths from fentanyl poisoning. We have definitely an epidemic here. We need to make sure we are holding those folks that are dealing these drugs accountable. But also, this is something we can't incarcerate our way out of. We also have to find very effective ways to help treat these individuals that unfortunately find themselves in the grip of substance abuse, especially opioid abuse, opioid addiction. So we're working on things like protecting Americans from fentanyl trafficking. That bill I'm a co-sponsor of, as well as support for patients in communities to reauthorize that act. That provides more resources to help communities address this. And then the CARES Act, which allows more dollars to go towards treatment and not rely on law enforcement to do those things. Those things I think are incredibly important. And Sheriff Diggs, I know, will speak a lot about that. He's had direct experience with the impact of substance abuse, alcohol abuse on communities, the stresses that it puts on sheriff's departments. So I am so honored to have Sheriff Diggs with us, now Senator Diggs. I always refer to him as Sheriff because I know he treasures the years that he spent there in York County and the incredible public service he provides, but doing even more for us now in the Virginia Senate. He's been a real voice of reason, and he there is a champion for law enforcement, champion for making sure that our communities are safer due to good legislation there in Richmond. And I know there's a lot of stuff that's coming through that's not so good, and Senator Diggs is there to help protect us with that. So Senator Diggs, with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to you.
Well, thank you, Robin, and appreciate you invite me to be part of your town hall meeting this evening. It's an honor to be with you. And hey, don't hesitate to call me Sheriff. Even the other senators and people that have known me for a very long time still continue to call me Sheriff. And quite frankly, I don't know which title is better, Sheriff or Senator. I certainly am tied to that Sheriff title. So, hey, Rob, you said a lot of great things. You're doing a lot of great work up there. I appreciate all you're doing at the federal level to help everybody across the entire country. All you're doing to recognize law enforcement officers and those who are doing frontline work. So here in Richmond, we're trying to do a lot of things as well. Not meeting with a lot of great success. For example, I introduced a bill that would allow for license plate readers, which we have been using for many years now and solving a lot of crimes with using that kind of data, to be able to allow local law enforcement agencies to put license plate readers on VDOT property, because the code was written here in Virginia that didn't allow such devices to be put on VDOT property. We thought we were that bill ended up dying. In fact, I ended up rolling my bill into with the majority leader Scott Serrabell's bill, because there were no restrictions on license plate reader data whatsoever in Virginia, and there was not appears to be any evidence that it was being abused in any kind of way whatsoever. But then it became controversial that, hey, it's not being regulated. We need to put some regulations on this, and law enforcement associations and agencies kind of came to an agreement with the parties involved that, hey, yes, hey, we don't mind the restrictions you want to put on it, because we're doing that anyway. It was about an audit trail and making sure that nobody was improperly using the data, that it was being used for legitimate law enforcement purposes only. But then there became some issues about how long we should keep the data. Should there be a search warrant? So there became a lot of things that were we couldn't all agree on, and the bill ended up dying in a bipartisan fashion, because but it was as I remember, a 1921 vote, but it was bipartisan in nature, because everybody had a lot of different concerns, whether we should have regulations, whether we should have more regulation, or whether we should be doing any kind of surveillance at all. But there is a House version of that still out there, so there's still hope for it. But so we're moving along. Also, I submitted a bill. Right now in Virginia, there's a law that says that people who are registered sex offenders, pedophiles, are not allowed in our local parks. And so there had been a couple cases where some less than desirable people were caught in some state parks, but it was not prohibited. I introduced a bill that would also prohibit registered sex offenders from being in state parks, and that bill failed on a party line vote. There's a lot of bills out there being put out by the other side that are really not doing much for victims. We try to look out for victims. It seems like the other side really is concerned about those who are incarcerated, trying to get them out early, giving them second chances. Nobody's opposed to a second chance, but we need to make sure that people are deserving of that second chance. And once they've served their time, doing all we can to make that second chance better. I don't know that giving people an automatic hearing to have their sentence reconsidered, it was necessarily a good idea, and that bill failed. We're doing all we can. I introduced a bill. It's called the Cody Bill, in honor of Cody Bigsby, the poor child that was murdered out in the city of Hampton. That is a program to help us find lost and missing children early in the process, much like an Amber Alert. But with an Amber Alert, one of the main criteria is that you have to either know or suspect that a child has been abducted. The Cody Alert is kind of a minor version of that without that requirement. So if a child has just, missing because he's followed a dog somewhere, or he's been lost in a department store, or whatever the case may be, something less than a Amber Alert that will come to bear a lot of resources, alert the community so that we can find lost and missing children as early as we can in the process. There's some other things. I mean, I think you mentioned that, hey, we need to do with fentanyl and opioids and all the drug addiction process. We need to do something with that. There was a bill that was introduced that would hold people who deal fentanyl and that drug dealing, and there's a direct nexus to somebody actually dying from it, that those people would be held account in a felony murder charge. That bill also failed. I don't know why we're not looking out for victims of crimes, and instead of protecting those who are committing crimes. In fact, in York County, while I was still the sheriff, we had an incident where a gentleman was responsible for a couple of deaths of some women out there. And we were unable to deal with it at the local level because state law didn't provide for that. However, we were fortunate enough that the federal government came in, the U.S. attorney came in, and we were able to prosecute that gentleman. And he's been sentenced to prison for providing drugs that led to the death of those who he gave it to. So there's a lot of things going on, and I'm really just kind of touching the surface. I don't want to dominate this conversation. So, Rob, you got any questions or anything that would keep me from just dominating this portion of our little town hall here?
Well, Danny, we've got some great questions from the folks that are participating in the virtual town hall. So why don't we go to those questions, and I'll read them out, and then both you and I can tag team and answer those questions. The first one is from Colonel Neil Thompson, who's in Henrico County. He says, in Henrico County, our police force is understaffed by over 100 positions. The police are intimidated by the Commonwealth Attorney, who wants to end the school to prison cycle at all costs. Shoplifting is up 30% year over year. Murders are at an all-time high. The November election offered alternatives, which the Democrat leading majority rejected. Are there alternatives to protect citizens? Well, Colonel Thompson, let me first start by the main point of what is a challenge for localities, and that is filling law enforcement positions. And I know Sheriff Diggs, I'm sure, has had the same challenge, and that is finding, first of all, individuals that want to serve. Second of all, individuals that qualify to serve, getting them trained and filling those positions. The way to keep our community safe is to have the proper number of law enforcement officers. You also need to have a Commonwealth's attorney that works with law enforcement, works with police chiefs, works with the sheriff's department. And listen, we want to end the cycle of students going from school to prison. We don't want that, but we also need to make sure that we hold criminals accountable. So if they are convicted of a crime and they have their day in court, they're innocent until proven guilty, but if they are convicted, they need to be held accountable. You can't have a revolving door and keep sending them back out in the street, because we know recidivism there is at an all-time high. People look at the penalties for committing crimes to determine what they do after that. And if the penalties are low, or if there is no penalties, they will be back. They will commit crime again. And when you talk about shoplifting, when people can smash and grab with little or no consequence, they're going to do more of it. Murders. You look at that violent crime. When the punishment there or the prosecution isn't what it needs to be, that's a problem. I want to make sure that we are doing everything we can to hold criminals accountable. And Sheriff, as you talked about, we also have to make sure that we are siding with victims in this. In every crime, there is a victim. And there may be victimless crimes. It may be, theft. But I would argue there's still a secondary effect. So if somebody shoplifts, while maybe it doesn't affect a person directly, it certainly affects the prices in that store. So that customer is going to end up paying a higher price because that store loses more and somebody has to pay for that. So I want to make sure that the law of the land is being followed, that we're holding criminals accountable. And Sheriff, you had a tremendous amount of experience there. So I'm going to call on you as Sheriff now to reflect on the question from Colonel Thompson.
Yeah, well, and you're right. Recruiting has become much harder over the years. Let's say 5, maybe even 10 years ago, at least 5 years ago, when we would put out a job application, we would get 200 applicants. Here in recent times, we would get as few as 25, and some of those were just people, filling out an application to continue their unemployment. So it has become much more difficult, and part of that reason is when applicants and even people who are in law enforcement, and so a lot of people are leaving when they don't think that their political leaders are behind them, when they see what's going on in San Francisco, where they're not even attempting to stop those smash and grabs and those, that mass shoplifting that's going on. I mean, it's becoming such a problem out there. Even big businesses, drugstores are closing altogether and leaving the city because nobody wants to enforce the law. And if you're not going to enforce the law on those kind of even lesser crimes, that whole feeling permeates throughout that, hey, I can get by with this, I can get by with something else. And it really starts the snowball effect of empowering criminals that, hey, there are no consequences for us committing criminal acts. So I've just heard it amongst so many active police officers that, hey, we're afraid if we go out here and we get ourselves in some trouble, we get into a controversial incident, that our political leaders are just going to throw us to the wolves. We're going to end up with a big monetary judgment against us, or maybe they're even going to, put criminal charges against us and put us in jail. It's just not worth it anymore to do that. So we really need the perception and the reality, and that our political leaders are going to back law enforcement, because it's not an easy job, and that's why it's important to hire to elect Commonwealth attorneys who are committed to enforcing the law. And we've seen that that's been a problem here in Virginia, some places, and certainly across the country, where Commonwealth attorneys, they want to pick and choose the laws that they want to enforce instead of the laws that society wants enforced. And so that's what we've got to do. And of course, salary is also a problem. We need to, like all public employees, whether it's a teacher, firefighter, or a law enforcement officer, they all need to be, paid with their worth. And we need to do what we can to try to help that out. So
I agree, Danny. Listen, I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to remind viewers that you can submit a question. So go to the prompt below on your screen there, and please, we welcome questions. We want to make sure we're here to answer your questions. So take the time to answer a question. We appreciate you joining us, being part of this and proposing your question to us. And we want to make sure that we're here to answer those questions. So Senator, let's go on to our next question. It comes from Douglas Clark. And he said, when will all the illegal actions taken by President Biden stop and the law of the land be followed again? Well, just like all of us, Douglas, the president, as well as members of Congress, state senators, and others, we're all required to follow the law. And if we don't, then there should be consequences. I know there's a lot of debate about, not being able to pick and choose. The executive branch is charged with enforcing the laws that are passed by the legislative branch. And regardless of whether you agree with them or not, they are the laws of the land, and there are consequences if you don't. Now, many of the things that Congress can do is to make sure that we hold the president accountable. There's several ways to do that. We can do that through what we fund or what we don't fund. We can also be more directive in the law and in appropriations bills. And then ultimately, Congress has the power to hold the executive branch accountable. And we did the other day with Secretary Mayorkas, who didn't enforce the law. And we know that between the president and Secretary Mayorkas, that there have been over 60 executive orders and directives that have weakened the enforcement of the laws at the border. That's not good for our country. We cannot continue to have this chaos at the border. And Congress's job is to make sure we hold people accountable. And we do that, as I said, by several ways, both through appropriations, through passage of laws, and then ultimately holding the president accountable and his cabinet through the provisions in the Constitution, which do include the ultimate option of impeachment. And we want to make sure that we hold that very, very at the very highest level of importance, and make sure that we are looking at everything. And the Homeland Security Committee went through an exhaustive effort, including consulting with immigration law experts as well as constitutional law experts before they came out with their recommendation. So we're doing everything we can to make sure that we're holding the executive branch accountable. The next question comes from John Duggar. He says, how can we fight the border crisis? Well, I'll answer a little bit about that. I want to turn it over to Sheriff Diggs too, because there are things that states are doing in response to the number of people coming across the border. The bottom line, John, is that, as I said, the executive branch has weakened the enforcement of existing laws. We believe that there are more than enough laws there that can be enforced to make sure that we have a secure border. The Biden administration, from almost the day that they went into office, weakened those laws. They rescinded many of the policies from President Trump, things like the Remain in Mexico policy, the effort to build the wall, the policy to process applications for asylum in the country of origin. There's no reason for people to travel 1,000 miles across Mexico to come to the United States. If you're seeking asylum, wouldn't you stop in the first country that you come to? This is more about getting to the United States, and I understand that, but we have to have an orderly system of immigration. When we have record amounts of people coming across the southern border illegally, many of those are on the terrorist watch list. Many of those, too, are Chinese nationals that don't have the interest of this country at heart, from also other countries around the world that want to do us harm. That is an impact on homeland security, on national security. All those things are critical. The president should be held accountable for enforcing the law at the border. He needs to do that. There's been a lot of debate about what that involves, a lot of debate about additional legislation. But the bottom line today is, if the president chose to, he could declare a national emergency and shut the border down tomorrow. The president chooses not to. The president also has a lot of tools with existing immigration law that he could use. He claims he doesn't have those tools, but he does. It's very clear that the law as it exists gives him those tools. And what's happening is this is creating a significant amount of stress on states. As those people illegally crossing the border come into the United States, and they go to states like Virginia, and they go to localities, all of a sudden school systems find themselves overwhelmed with students that they did not plan for, that they don't have the resources for. If you look at major cities, New York City, a great example, needing billions of additional dollars to house, to feed, to educate these individuals that are coming across that just are beyond the capacity of the city to deal with that. Those things are incredibly important. And Senator Diggs, I know that you have some legislation in Richmond that's being considered concerning the illegal immigration happening at the border. So I want to turn it over to you to get your perspective.
Well, Rob, you're right. And this is an excellent question, because, everybody used to think all this illegal immigration was just the border states. Well, now every state is a border state, because there's so many people come across, and they can quickly just fan out through the entire country. And it's bad enough we've got those people who are legitimate, that are actually seeking some kind of political asylum. We would welcome those people with open arms. But there's so much drugs coming across, whether it be marijuana, fentanyl. I saw something earlier today that there was hundreds of pounds of fentanyl that have been seized at the border, just in the last few months. If we're seizing that much, think how much is getting past us. We seize very little and catch very little people who are like terrorists or who are criminals, crossing our borders. There's many more that are just slipping, through our fingers down there because of the bad policy. So we need to do all that we can to help our border states. I know that the governor here has sent some of our National Guard people down to help the National Guard in Texas, and we need to do all that we can to do that. There was a bill, I believe, that it failed, that would provide health care for all illegal immigrant children. While certainly we have compassion for kids, we don't certainly know that in any child that is in need of emergency medical care, they're going to get that. But the cost would have been astronomical. And it's like, putting up a big sign, at the border of Virginia, come here for free health care if you're illegally in the country. And it's just not good policy to encourage people to come here to get all the free stuff. We just need to, while still being compassionate and caring and giving people the things that they need, you just can't give them a blank check and free everything while there's citizens out here in Virginia that don't have health care. So we need to look out for our citizens first and then do what we can for others.
Senator, I think those are great points. What we're seeing in many states is just being overwhelmed by the number of people illegally coming across the border. I want to remind our viewers that are online here, thanks so much for joining us. You have a prompt at the bottom where you can ask us a question. So please don't hesitate. Put a question in there, ask us a question. Senator Diggs and I are here to answer your questions. So let's go to our next question, Senator. We're going to go to Tracy Meadows, who asked, what are you and your colleagues doing to address the issue of gun violence? Are you supporting safe storage bills or funding more mental health resources? Well, I can talk a little bit about the federal level, but first let me talk about what I experience each and every day. And Tracy, I'm sure that you come from the same background with your family. My wife was a retired school teacher, taught for 41 years. I have 6 grandchildren, every one of them in the public school system. So like you, very concerned about the safety of our children, and for that matter, the safety of society overall. I want to make sure we're doing everything we can to address gun violence and mass shootings. I want to make sure that we're holding people that commit crimes with guns accountable. I want to make sure that people that under the law should not be able to buy guns are held accountable, and that's to assure that our criminal database is up to date and make sure that people are using it properly, and that if somebody tries to purchase a firearm that is legally ineligible, that is, they are a convicted felon or adjudicated as mentally ill and they try to buy a gun, we need to hold them criminally responsible. There is a bill that passed last year called the Fix-NICS Act, which is the National Information Criminal System that has information in there on criminals to make sure that when you go to buy a gun, they check to see, are you eligible based on your criminal or mental health history? I want to make sure that those things are enforced. As far as safe storage, listen, I'm 100% in favor of safe storage. Listen, I have firearms at home. We make sure that we keep them locked. I have a big gun safe. It is critically important. I have grandchildren. I don't want them getting a hold of my firearms. That's not a place for them unless it's under direct supervision at a range where they can safely use the firearms. But that's not inside of a home where somebody can grab a gun of any type and potentially endanger somebody. So that is key. In Congress, I'm co-sponsoring the Securing Our Students Act, which uses unspent COVID funding to install infrastructure and technologies to strengthen the security that schools can put in place. There are a lot of things that they can do that make schools more secure, that help us identify where threats are. I want to make sure that we're doing that. I talked about the Fix-NICS Act that passed in the 117th Congress. Also, the Stop School Violence Act, which helps schools and law enforcement prevent, recognize, and respond to early warning signs of violence, especially too that where students may be saying things or doing things that indicate they may have a propensity or maybe planning an act of violence. We want to make sure we get out in front of that. The question also involves, what are you doing about mental health? Listen, mental and behavioral health issues, I think, are at an all-time high in this nation. And we have to make sure we devote the resources to address those issues. Last year, the 21st Century Cures Act was signed into law. It funds mental health services, and we can do even more. I know Sheriff Diggs knows in his experience in local law enforcement, many times law enforcement is charged with being the mental health agency. They are not designed to do that. Jails are not a place to deal with folks that have mental health conditions. We want to make sure our community service boards have the resources that they need. And we are at a critical shortage of behavioral and mental health professionals. We have to do more in our education system to get folks into that profession, and then do more to make sure that we are funding all of our efforts. And the community-based efforts are the best. You know, we don't want to be filling institutions with people with behavioral and mental health. We want to make sure that we treat them for behavioral and mental health and make sure they're productive members of community. One other bill, too, before I turn it over to Senator, is the Mass Violence Protection Act that ensures local, state, and federal law enforcement can better share information and coordinate responses. So if something happens and there's an indication that maybe somebody is planning something, they can share information. So maybe some of the federal level gathers that. We want to make sure local law enforcement knows that, state law enforcement. And then too, if there is by chance, Lord forbid, a incidents where somebody is perpetrating this violence against others, that we have a quick response so we minimize the impact of that particular event. And we see more and more that we see interdiction happening incredibly quickly. We see the unfortunate tragedy in Kansas City, but we saw how quickly law enforcement acted, and we saw that that they were able to interdict that quickly. In fact, citizens jumped to the avail there and actually apprehended the gunman who unfortunately decided to invoke harm on his neighbors there in Kansas City. So with that, I'll turn to Sheriff Diggs, Senator Diggs, and get his perspective. He's experienced this firsthand.
Well, one of the ways to cut down on gun violence is to aggressively prosecute those who engage in gun violence. I know that when we get reports of shots fired and we end up somewhere and nothing's really happened, just some shots fired, and we collect shell casings on the street, or there has been an actual shooting, we collect shell casings. What we find out is many of these shell casings match, which tells us that there's very few people doing this gun violence or committing gun violence, but they're doing it multiple times. So when you catch one person doing that, you have, through a multiplier, stopped a lot of gun violence. So the goal is to aggressively, and we found this out back in, I believe it was the 90s here local, with a program called Project Exile, where the goal was to identify those people who used guns illegally, who possessed guns illegally, and who used them in crimes illegally. Back at that time, Richmond was the murder capital, not of just Virginia, but the murder capital of the country per capita. And through that program, they were able to, just in a few short years, significantly cut the murder rate in Richmond, because what we found out is there's a very few people committing a lot of crimes, and that includes gun violence. And even now today, the Attorney General, Jason Miyares, has a project very similar, that's called Project Ceasefire. And again, it tries to do the same thing, identify those who have guns illegally, use guns illegally, and aggressively prosecute those people. In fact, I introduced a bill this year that would have doubled the amount of mandatory crime that you would get for using a gun in your second offense. Now, you've already used a gun once and you've been to prison and you're back out again. Now it's your second go round. Like you didn't learn the first time that you're going to go to jail, was to increase that penalty from 5 years to 10 years on a second offense. Now, there was an anti-gun group who was pretty well organized and who does good work in the community, trying to get their viewpoint across. They're anti-gun, yet they got up and opposed my bill to increase the penalty because they were against mandatory minimum sentences. Well, that just doesn't carry the water. I mean, if you're against gun violence, then you've got to be for adequate punishment that sends a message to everybody else. You use a gun in the commission of a felony, then you need to go to jail for a long time, especially if it's your second offense. Yeah. So that's some of the things that are going on here in Richmond.
Well, Senator, thanks. I know that you're very, very focused on that with your decades of experience in law enforcement, all you've done to keep communities safe, and know that, being strict on gun violence, strong penalties, strict enforcement does a lot to deter gun violence. We want to make sure that guns are stored properly, and we have to address mental and behavioral health issues, some of the underlying causes of gun violence. Next question is from Jesse James. He said, what's being done to support more law enforcement recruitment and retention needs? And Sheriff, I know you've lived that each and every day, and I keep going back to your term sheriff, because that's how I think in these instances we should address you. And so I'm going to turn that question over to you and your thoughts on law enforcement recruitment and retention.
Well, I think we kind of touched on this question here a few minutes ago, and it's not easy. And hey, if you talk to any kind of businessman or any kind of professional, there's shortages in dental hygienists, there's shortages in waitresses, there's shortages in nurses, there's certainly shortage in mental health workers. So there is this shortage of everybody in almost every profession there are out there. So we're all competing. So a way of doing that again is people have to know, people who are thinking about entering law enforcement, knowing that, hey, when they take on this tough job, that there's going to be support of their political leaders, and that their judges and their Commonwealth attorneys, that when you go out here and you catch a bad guy, you catch somebody using a gun who has shot somebody, shot at somebody, used a gun in a robbery, that you're out here risking your life to catch, and they get nothing but a slap on the wrist, and that there's no real significant penalty. There's a lot of people who don't want to put themselves in that position. So again, the answer is the same. We need to pay our people better. We need to treat them well, and they need to know that they're going to be backed by their political leaders.
Sheriff, that's a great point. I know some of the bills at the federal level, the National Law Enforcement Officers Remembrance, Support, and Community Outreach Act does just that, supports the families and the members of the law enforcement community, sends a strong message that we're there. Also, the Back the Blue Act that creates new penalties and stricter jail sentences for those that perpetrate violence against law enforcement officers. We have to increase the penalties to, as you said, hold people accountable. That has a great deterrent effect on those that even think about going after a law enforcement officer. So those things are critically important. Sheriff, we have another question, and it's from Michael Hopkins. And Michael says, as a former sheriff, what is your opinion of the causes of gun violence? And are there any reasonable substantive measures to address it? The status quo does not seem to be working. We talked a little bit about that, but I want to turn that question over to you from Michael Hopkins.
Boy, a tough question. If I knew the answer to that, what was the cause of gun violence, I would probably be much more than a senator if I had a real answer to that question. I don't know. But part of it is our culture today. So many people are using guns, and whether it be gang related or whatever the cause may be, part of the answer to this is to stop this culture of gun violence being acceptable is what I just said. We've got to hold people accountable. There has to be a substantial penalty, enough of a penalty that people are going to be afraid to use a gun in the commission of a crime. Part of the other part of gun violence is we're disarming so many of our law-abiding citizens that there's very little fear of anybody being, repelled by a citizen, because they're making it so difficult for citizens to carry the guns to protect themselves. And you just cannot have a law enforcement officer on every corner. So what's the cause? Boy, that's a tough one. I really don't know what the cause is, but I know contributing factors are that there's no fear of a penalty. There's no fear of being repelled, because it's like shooting fish in a barrel. You're going to go into a gun-free zone and impose your will on somebody else with a gun because nobody else has one. So that's the best answer I can give you. I think there's people out there who are a lot smarter and have done some research on this. And but I'm doing my part by supporting our law enforcement officers and trying to make the penalties harsher, especially for those who use a gun in the commission of a crime.
Well, Sheriff, I think that's incredibly important to make sure that people are held accountable. Also, making sure we're getting after some of the behavioral and mental health issues. So we'll remind our viewers, you're online here, please take an opportunity to go to the prompt below. If you got a question, please enter your question there. We'd love to be able to take your question. That's what we're here for. And I appreciate all the list of questions that we have, but we want to make sure we get more. And believe me, folks, we will, if we don't get to them directly, we will make sure every one of your questions gets answered. Sheriff, our next question is, what are politicians doing to try to restore the public confidence in them? And I'll speak from the Washington level. I know you want to speak from what's happening there in Richmond. Listen, there's lots of debate about what needs to happen both here in the House and in the U.S. Senate. Our nation is divided, and it's reflected in our legislative bodies. We have very narrow margins here of majority. It is a challenge to find a majority vote on lots of different issues. But we work diligently every day. We engage everyone, even people on the other side of the aisle. We have more and more votes now that are bipartisan. That is gaining votes on the other side of the aisle, because narrow margins, sometimes that's the only way forward to be able to do that. The people in our districts expect us to get things done. They expect us to have vigorous debates. They expect us to stand by good principles of government. They expect us to protect them. They expect us to spend their money responsibly. They expect us to do the right thing. But they also understand that they're never going to have 100% of what they want fulfilled in any decision made by government. That just doesn't happen. It doesn't happen in our regular lives. We all have families, and we know that in a family, you don't get 100% of what you want 100% of the time. The same way in businesses. And I always tell folks, you want Congress to reflect reality. Well, what we want to do is to find the area of greatest agreement and get those things done. Things, unfortunately, today become much more divided, much more partisan than many times what they need to be. I think people get frustrated too to look at the things they believe government needs to be doing, and those things don't happen. That's a frustration. But ultimately, it's our responsibility to get things done. And I always look at each and every day about figuring out how can I get things done. And it's important to look at where you have things in common. I always look for other members, even ones on the other side of the aisle, that I have things in common with. A great example is, I do some bills each year with Hakeem Jeffries, who's the minority leader on the opposite side of the aisle. Now, he and I couldn't be more polar opposites in Congress. He has a district in New York City. Couldn't be any different than America's first district. But you know what? We have a common interest, and that is making sure that we are supporting our wildlife refuges. And people go, wildlife refuge, New York City, how is that happening? But there are wildlife refuges there in the region, and Hakeem and I work together on that. It's a place where we agree. It may be a little tiny place, but it's a place where we agree, and we actually are able to get things done. I think that's the foundation of making sure that our government works. We can have very, very vigorous debates. We can disagree adamantly, but ultimately, we have to find a path forward to get things done. So, Senator, I'll turn it over to you, because I know you being a new senator there, I'm sure you're experiencing all the different back and forth between the two parties and seeing what's happening there in the Senate. But I'll turn it over to you to let us know about your experience.
Well, I think for politicians to get their confidence restored, and the citizens to restore their confidence is, hey, when you make campaign promises, you've got to keep them. Promises made, promises kept. That's what you've got to do. And you're exactly right, Rob. You've got to work across the aisle with people of the opposite party, with people with different views. My license plate reader bill, I was certainly very pleased that I was able to have my bill rolled into the majority leader on the other side. Senator Saravel was kind enough to let me roll my bill into his, and I was the chief co-patron on that. I had another bill that helped clarify how law enforcement officers from other states could come to Virginia and get their certifications. And I was happy to have Senator Dave Marsden from up in Northern Virginia sign on as chief co-patron to that bill. And so I have made it an effort to talk to people on the other side about those bills and other bills, as all, because there's very few. While it takes up a lot of time, there's a very few issues that are really that controversial. The needs of both sides of the issue are met, and we're just trying to move things forward and making Virginia a better place to live, to work, and to raise a family. And that's really what my goal is. People say, "Hey, what's your number one goal?" My goal is to make the lives of Virginia a good place to live, work, and raise a family, and to make sure that they're safe.
Good. Well, thanks, Senator. We got our next question from Nora Pfeiffer. She said, could you explain how you view fentanyl use related to people crossing the border illegally? a lot of debate about the influence of drug cartels in Mexico, what's happening with the flow of fentanyl across the border. We know a lot of that fentanyl originates in China, unfortunately. I don't think they have our best interest in mind. Why would you be manufacturing a drug that you know has incredible harm when it's abused with human beings? Another thing, too, is we need to look at what's happening with those cartels and how drugs are moving across the border. Some say, well, it's all U.S. citizens. No, it's many of those are what are called mules, which are individuals that are hired by the drug cartels to infiltrate the border. They're not the ones that raise their hands and say, hey, come and get me. They're the ones that purposely sneak across the border and bring significant amount of drugs. You look at the drugs that are interdicted at the border every day, people that try to come through checkpoints. It is significant. A lot of it, much of it comes through the southern border. So illegal border crossings, people coming across undetected, are a big, big portion of that. The key is secure our border. I do think it has a significant impact. We need to secure the border. We also need to make sure that we are holding accountable those countries like China that produce those drugs and specifically ship them into places in Mexico for them to be transported across the southern border. Those things, I think, are also very, very important. A secure southern border will help us. It won't eliminate all of it, but it'll significantly reduce the flow of fentanyl into the country. I think that those things are absolutely essential to us being able to limit what comes in. Another thing, too, is you have to not just look at the supply side, but you have to look at the demand side. We have to treat fentanyl and opioid abuse. People have a physical, a biochemical addiction that's very, very hard to break. So we have to look at way out of it. I talk to many sheriffs who also manage jails, and they are overwhelmed with folks in the jails trying to make sure they don't find themselves back in jail again because they can't fight the addiction that they suffer from with opioids and in turn fentanyl. So, Senator, I'll turn it over to you because I know you have direct experience with this also.
Yeah, well, so the question is, how do you relate the fentanyl use to people crossing the border illegally? Border is so porous that the cartels use the border very easily as that conduit to get their illegal drugs, and they do it using innocent people. They use them as mules, or half the family is still in another country, and half the family may be in the U.S. And these cartels use that as leverage. Look, we'll help you get across the border if you tote these drugs for us. If you become a courier for these drugs, we'll get you across the border. We'll reunite you with your family, or you do this first, and we'll bring the rest of your family up. So that's the connection: is the cartels use the porous border, the situation of the border, and the lack of enforcement down there. It makes their conduit to transport these drugs and make money so much easier. So strict border enforcement would certainly cut down on the supply side. And when you cut down on the supply side, you would at least hope that would make it certainly less available and that less people would have the opportunity to get addicted.
Yeah, and when people try to avoid detection coming across the border, many times for nefarious, a lot of times it's because they're smuggling drugs into the country. Those things, I think, are a big deal. And again, securing the border helps us manage that. It won't stop all of it, but it'll reduce the flow significantly. Senator, now we have Stuart Risden, who says Congress is not providing the agencies that protect the border with the resources they need. Why won't you give them the resources they need? Well, Stuart, we do. We have voted in resources through the appropriations bill to make sure that our Border Patrol agents have what they need. Here's what's happening. The Biden administration is deciding that those law enforcement officers, those Border Patrol officers, instead of being there to patrol the border, are instead assigned to process the folks that are coming across the border. So they're there processing those individuals, getting them on buses, getting them to different parts of the United States. So they're not even there in person to be able to interdict people crossing the border, to make sure people know that there's security there at the border. So I would argue it's not resourcing, it's how those Border Patrol officers are assigned. And listen, I've talked to multiple Border Patrol officers that said, sir, if we could just do our job is to patrol and secure the border. But instead, we're being charged with doing other things that have nothing to do with border security. I think that's the big issue here. It's not a matter of resourcing, it's a matter of how the resource is used. How is the Biden administration not doing the things that they're required to do under the law? The law is very clear that the Border Patrol, Customs and Border Enforcement Agency is charged with securing the border, with patrolling the border to minimize the number of illegal crossings. It's hard to do when they have tens of thousands of people that come across every day, and they're more about processing those individuals than they are about patrolling the border. That's really where the big issue there is at the border. So, Senator, let's go ahead and take our next question. The next question is: mental health issues are at an all-time high. So too is violence and antisocial behavior. What role do you think the breakdown of the nuclear family plays in these critical issues? I have not heard it mentioned tonight. That's from Richard Crowder. And Richard, you've got a great point. I think that a strong family structure provides the direction that young folks need. People that may be thinking about acting out violently, understand too that there are ways for them to vent maybe their inner feelings about what they may have in acting out violently against others. But the nuclear family and structure in the family provides a lot. I mean, parents have a tremendous influence over the lives of their children, and giving them that structure and making sure they learn very specifically what is right, what is wrong, making sure they understand that even no matter what you feel, no matter what issues you're going through, acting out violently is not in any way, shape, or form the way to deal with your issues, or not acceptable in any form. And you have to have supportive people around you to be able to counter what sometimes is an influence on our children to be able to do those things. Listen, there are all kinds of different influences in the world today, and I'm not saying that those influences are the main cause of that behavior, but the family structure, moms and dads can do a tremendous amount to make sure their children, stay on the right track, and that if there are things that maybe influence them in one way or the other, parents are the biggest impact on their children's lives, and they are the biggest, I think, directors in how children's antisocial behavior or other things that may manifest itself can be taken care of and make sure it doesn't result in somebody else being harmed. So, Senator?
Yeah, I think you're right. The breakdown of the nuclear family, the traditional family of, a two-parent household, well, because it just makes it's difficult to raise children. So a two-parent household, while one's at work, the other can be watching, the child, raising the child. When there are successful single parent households, and they do an outstanding job, and they do the best they can. I'm not being faulting of that at all, but it's difficult because a single family, single parent household, somebody has to go to work, and when they go to work, either they got to have somebody else childcare, or they're leaving that child at home, and then there's no direction. Where are they getting their values? Is it off of TV? Is it off of TikTok or Facebook? Social media. It's just easier for a traditional nuclear family to raise kids. There's that bonding, that reinforcement of both parents on, hey, what's right, what's wrong, and a lot of single parents households do an outstanding job of trying to get it done, but it's just so much more difficult to do that with one person. So you just can't deny the old-fashioned nuclear family seemed to provide an easier process to raise children than many of the difficult situations that people are going through. And it's not that they're trying hard; it's just more difficult. And we certainly appreciate all those single parents out there who are doing the best they can to raise their children. It's just more difficult, and that traditional family just makes it easier.
Yeah. Sheriff, I agree. Family structure is critical. Parents have lots of challenges today, but the most impactful way to keep a child from exhibiting these behaviors that could result in violence is through strong parental child relationships. Those things are key. Our next question comes from Brian Donegan, and it says, why is Congress having such a hard time pushing the executive branch to do its job and protect the border? I thought there were mechanisms, especially in the House, to check the executive. And Brian, there are. The House has the power of the purse. And what we can do in the appropriations bill is to direct the executive branch to do things. And we work to make sure the resource. We had an earlier question about, what about why isn't the border being properly resourced? Well, it is. We put resources in there and we direct the executive branch to do that. Unfortunately, what happens right now is the executive branch chooses to do other things with those resources. The challenge is then what's the recourse does the Congress have if it doesn't follow the directives that Congress puts in place? Many times what we can do is to take away dollars, but in this instance, taking away dollars is actually counterproductive because having fewer Border Patrol agents doesn't do the job. What happens is Border Patrol agents are getting reassigned to do other things and aren't directly involved in securing the border. That's the big problem, is getting the executive branch to follow the law. As I said, our main mechanism is through funding, and the ability for us to affect the outcome many times is limited. That's why you see today, many suits being filed by people that live along the border who are harmed by these policies of the administration not enforcing the law, and the massive number of people that come over, the destruction that happens to their property, the sometimes the crimes and violence that are committed there, the impact that they see from drug cartels and others coming across the border. So it is, while the House can do certain things, many times we are limited in the things that we can do here. As Senator Diggs pointed out, he also can do things at the state, and Senator may want to talk about things that are happening there in Richmond. I know there's a lot of debate about what's happening there in the Commonwealth. And I know we got asked a question too about what are the costs. The main cost of this illegal border crossings are not being borne necessarily by the federal government. They're being borne by state and local government. So Senator, I'll turn it over to you.
You're right. So that cost is, and you mentioned it earlier, there's the possibility that some of our school systems are overwhelmed, and some of our school systems aren't necessarily prepared to teach English as a second language. Then there are our hospitals, our medical facilities, all of these things, our food programs, whether it be SNAP or TANF, all of these various social programs that are needed for our own citizens now become, very much stressed just handling the caseload. And so all this stuff trickles down to our state and local governments. So it is very important that securing the border would solve a lot of problems on a lot of different fronts.
That's the key, and we're doing everything we can to get the executive branch to follow the law. And we do have some tools to do that, but many times the tools are limited. And under Article 3, the judicial branch also has a role there. So, well, Senator Diggs, I thank you. I want to thank everybody that's joined us tonight, everybody that's asked a question. This is our last question for the evening, but we encourage you to visit our websites. You can track Senator Diggs online. You can just Google Senator Danny Diggs. He has a place where you can go and get information on what he's doing in the General Assembly. I know I get his weekly e-newsletter to give me an update on all the great work that he's doing there. You can also go to our website, which is www.wittman, that's WITTMAN, .house.gov. You can sign up for our e-newsletter. We'll give you almost daily updates on what's happening here. But I cannot thank Senator Diggs enough for joining us. I want to thank all of our folks that joined us on the virtual town hall tonight. And Senator Diggs, I'm going to give you the last word, and then we will close out tonight.
Well, thank you, Congressman Wittman, for inviting me to be part of your town hall this evening, and certainly thanks to all the people who participated and who are listening out there, and those who presented questions for us this evening. And hey, I always learn something when I'm out talking to constituents and listening to what their concerns are. So again, thank you very much, and I'll be doing my best to represent people in my district and the entire state of Virginia while I'm here in Richmond.
Well, thanks so much, Senator Diggs. We appreciate it. Thanks to all of the folks that joined us on tonight's virtual town hall. We look forward to joining you again and again. Don't hesitate to go to our websites and get the most up-to-date information. Thanks again. I wish each of you God's continued blessings. May God bless our great Commonwealth of Virginia, and may God bless our United States of America.